So hello everyone and welcome to today's episode of The Sordid Skeptic. I'm Shredder Steve and today we're going to be talking a little bit about virtue. And I'm here with my co-host, Timmy.
Yo.
Right. So we got a great episode in store for you guys today. We're going to be talking a little bit about virtue and why it's the best way to orient yourself in the world and how it's going to lead to a better life for everybody. So let's start this off a little bit, Tim, with a quick discussion of eudaimonia and how that would translate. Because I know it seems to translate as happiness, but it seems to be a little bit deeper than that. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it means essentially, a sense of human flourishing and prosperity. And this, in a way, it correlates to why we'd want to add virtue to our life. And essentially, it helps us achieve a sense of excellence. So, we move further away from evil and closer to good. And
that's definitely something we want to have more of in today's society. Am I right?
Yeah, exactly. I think, I think people, I know myself, I'm trying to find my way, and I think studying virtue and exercising it is a good way to bring this about and lead a more productive, happier life.
Fantastic.
So I think the Greeks were onto something.
Yeah, definitely. It's an idea that's a couple thousand years old now, but I think they were definitely onto something as well. Mm-hmm. And I think having these virtues is something that's definitely going to help stabilize our society a little bit. And like you said, move that needle a little bit closer towards the good. So let's start it off with talking a little bit about this golden mean that Aristotle talks about in his Nicomachean Ethics. He makes this distinction between intellectual virtues like wisdom, intelligence, prudence, and moral virtues, which describe more about a person's character, like their temperance, for example, like moderation.
Mm-hmm. And a moral virtue is the outcome of action and habit, and thus we acquire virtues by exercising them. So it can be compared to learning an art. So, for example, if we want to become builders, we do that by building. Similarly, if we want to become just, we do that by doing just acts. So the main argument is that an excess, too much of, or deficiency, not enough, of an action or feeling is harmful, whereas a suitable amount, right in between the vices, generally produces the best outcome. Therefore, virtue is a mean state or the middle way.
Yeah, I can definitely see that.
Like
how it is sort of like walking that middle road a little bit. How I guess if you were to go too far in either direction, you can run into those deficiencies and excesses that he talks about. And it seems to be something, I can't remember the guy who I guess came up with this, but it was taken off of the Aristotle idea of this mean, where it's almost like common sense. Anyone can observe something that's better and something that's worse, and it seems like walking that middle road is definitely important here. So I'm just going to switch over to our other slide here to talk a little bit about the different concepts of this golden mean. So the ones we're going to go over today are going to be courage, generosity, ambition, modesty, honesty, good humor, friendship, temperance, composure, and self-control. Now, there's definitely a lot to go over with there, so definitely stay tuned as we dive further into these topics. So, do you want to just jump in? We could talk a little bit about courage.
Yeah, sure. So with courage, so the person who avoids everything and faces nothing becomes a coward, but a person who is not afraid of anything but willing to face everything is a fool.
Yeah, I see what you're saying there. It's like, what was that phrase? It's wise men or fools rush in where wise men never go, something like that.
Yeah. Well, the actual quote I found was it's by Alexander Pope. It's fools rush in where angels fear to tread.
Ah, wow, that's a little bit more lyrical.
But still, both work, I think. Get the same message across, for sure.
Definitely. So virtues are derived from spheres of action or feeling. Courage is linked to fear and confidence. So what do you think about that? Like courage being linked to both fear and confidence. I guess you'd have to be afraid of something for it to really be considered courage, right? Like Superman, for example, maybe not so courageous because he's invulnerable. I've heard that as a
Mm.
critique. So if there's no actual danger and you don't really have any skin in the game, nothing on the line, can one really call that courage?
It's a good question. I just think of like doing presentations, because that's kind of like the number one fear for a lot of people, even beating death, right? And,
Public
you
speaking,
know,
absolutely, and it's
yeah.
that's why I'm glad we're kind of going through this process and doing these podcasts because it's sort of like public speaking without as much of the I guess the audience directly in front of you causing you to maybe lose your nerve a little bit. Is
Hmm.
definitely an uncomfortable process if you haven't done a whole lot of it. I know people have these different tips and tricks for how to overcome that, but I think practice and just kind of doing it and realizing that hey, I made it out of there alive. It probably could have gone a lot worse.
Hmm.
It's a
Yeah, and I
good way to
think
get over that.
this links a bit to our talk of anxiety too. Like if
Yeah,
there's, you know, it's kind of hard to to do difficult things. There's usually going to be like, this conflict of like hope and, anxiety, or, hope and death or whatever. And there's going to be that conflict, right? And we exhibit our courage by, doing these things despite that feeling, right? So,
absolutely. So the golden mean, it's like an outline based on reason, but it's not an exact science because I guess this sort of predates science by several hundred years. So I guess to try to look at it through a
yeah.
scientific lens might be a little erroneous because they didn't really have the kind of science back then that we do now. Um, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, it's, a lot of these terms, they mean, they're kind of general in a sense, but the more you think about them, and you think about them relative to your situation, that's where you use your reason to figure it out, right?
yeah,
And
context and proportionality and all these things Aristotle talks about as being very important to the situation. Like anybody can get
mhm,
angry, but you got to be angry at the right person for the right reason in the right context. Does that make sense?
yeah, yeah, and that links to how there are many ways of going wrong, as evil is infinite in nature, but good is finite. So it's easy to miss the mark, but it's difficult to hit it. And in a way, this is linked to the idea of sin, which was originally an archery term, which meant to miss the mark, right?
Definitely, like
So,
it's infinitely easier to hit anything else than the bullseye. You know what I mean? Like if you're aiming for something, it's way easier to miss than it is to actually make contact with that target. And
and it's easy to be angry at everything, whereas it's a lot harder to be, angry at the right person, right time, right cause, the right amount,
oh yeah,
for
that's
the right reason.
infinitely more difficult. It's definitely easy to be, I guess, angry at being itself because life is kind of tragic. I mean, all of us are destined to die, and it's probably not going to be peacefully. It's either going to be suddenly and violently, or it's going to be slowly and painfully, and that's kind of a shitty thing to think about.
And we can try to minimize the suffering around us within
Yes,
ourselves, and
ameliorate it to the point where maybe it's only tragic. It's merely tragic, rather than it being
mhm,
catastrophe or even worse, like completely hell-like, right?
right,
So you definitely don't
right.
want to have catastrophe descend into hell, and I think orienting yourself towards the proper virtues is a great way of dealing with that. So let's see
Hmm.
here. So if we can't hit the mean, then the next best thing would be choosing the lesser of two evils, which would involve being aware of what we're prone to and dragging ourselves away from that in order to arrive at the mean. So I know, depending on people's temperance, it's definitely easier for some people to be deficient in one thing because that's the easiest course, and maybe for other people it's easy to be excessive in that same degree because that's the, I guess, easiest course based on their own temperament.
And I suppose being aware of the certain things that draw you to your vices, and learning how to mitigate those factors, I suppose. Like, I don't know. Let's say you have a lot of friends who like to, I don't know, drink a lot
Hmm.
or whatever, and that could be a difficult thing to change, of course. Or, if you're trying to like just reduce your drinking and go less out to establishments, that would trigger that. Or, you know, just, yeah, being aware of these different factors that could lead to, your downfall, I suppose.
Definitely,
right?
and that's one of the biggest struggles with alcoholics is that if all your friends are also alcoholics, giving up drinking doesn't just mean you stop drinking. It also means you have to stop going to the places you always go to and hanging out with the people that you always go to, and that's a lot of dead wood to burn off all at once. That might leave you with basically nothing, right?
Yeah, that's a very hard lifestyle change for sure.
Definitely. So let's see what else we got here. So virtue is a state of intentional moral purpose consisting in a mean that is relative to ourselves, the mean being determined by reason. And I know Aristotle did talk a lot about this, about how the main mode of being for humans is to reason. It's, I guess, to cite the cliche, it's what separates us from the bloody animals. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So let's dive into some of these other virtues here. So we did talk a little bit about courage and how that's a balance between excess, being rashness, and a deficiency of that being cowardice. So I guess when you want to be courageous, you don't want to act in a way that's foolish, but you also don't want to act in a way that's cowardly. So how do we go about finding that balance? What do you think?
Yeah. Well, with rashness, essentially it's linked to like impulsiveness, right? So it's like acting too quickly or without forethought. And I think of driving when I think of rashness. So, you know, if you're like in angry mood, you're going to run more red lights. You're going to take more risks, you know.
And you're going to take those, cut people off. And if you get cut off, you're probably going to take it a little bit more personally. You know what I mean? It's like that guy is intentionally out to cut me off. Well, first of all, because he's a dick, obviously. And obviously I'm a victim.
What other explanation could there be?
What other explanation could there possibly be? Obviously that guy's a dick because he cut me off. I mean, it couldn't be that, you know, maybe he's in a hurry because he has a sick relative in the hospital, or he's, you know, late for an important business meeting, or anything else that might externalize that a little bit. It's much easier to, I guess, to make that a character attack on the person that wronged you. And then, of course, with you, you're just a victim of circumstance. It has nothing to do with you being overly reactive or unable to control your emotions or anything like that, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it could put yourself in much more danger.
Yeah, definitely. Because, I mean, human beings are not designed to travel at those speeds. And that becomes perfectly evident when, you know, we have tens of thousands of people being killed by cars every year. And a lot of it is probably preventable. But hey, you know, those automated cars are coming, and I think that'll probably ameliorate a lot of that stuff. But an interesting fact I actually heard from, I think it was Molyneux. He was talking about how there's so many different things that are linked to intelligence, and one of them is the outcome of car accidents. Like, people that are more intelligent tend to get in fewer car accidents, which I thought was kind of interesting. So, I mean, it's one of these... G factor is one of these things that can link to a lot of things like that. So it's probably good to be smart when you're behind the wheel, because not only is your life in your hands, but a lot of other people's are as well.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and I just had the definition of cowardice is a lack of courage to face danger, difficulty, opposition, or pain.
Yeah, and I mean, that it sounds like
maybe this is the person who is, you know, freaked out at driving at all, or, you know, maybe had some traumatic experience related to that, and, you know, they don't want to risk it. But there could be other examples for sure, like with how we mentioned presentations too, right? And how, you know, you can be scared of people judging you, you know, while you're speaking, and other factors too, right? So
yeah, I mean, I certainly that avoiding danger is definitely an adaptive strategy for survival, but I think when you get this serious deficiency of courage, then that can certainly be as much of a problem as an excess of rashness.
Mm-hmm.
So next up we have generosity. So this would be a balance between being stinginess and miserliness, or basically being a cheapskate, and then extravagance. Now, I know we talked a little bit about this before, where in society, people that are too generous with you, it can create this uncomfortable reaction when you feel that you're not able to pay that back. So people tend to shy away from people that are excessively generous, because I guess it sets up an expectation that can never really be met. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember you mentioned before there was that Family Guy exotic fish.
Yes.
That was bought for Peter.
That's right. So Peter gets a gift of, this like exotic fish, and it's like, oh great, I guess I'm gonna have to go to the pet store and get an aquarium and all this expensive food and all that. Thanks a lot for this. Right? So yeah, you definitely don't want to engage in so much generosity that you're placing a burden on those around you.
Yeah, yeah, and also in terms of extravagance too, like just within your, for me, like there was a point where I was living in Toronto, like I was renting in Toronto,
Mhm.
I was eating out a lot, and I was also leasing a car, and this just like equaled constant debt,
Oh,
like every
absolutely.
month,
Yeah, it's
and it became a little extravagant, and it was a lesson for me, to live within my means,
yeah,
essentially.
absolutely. And I think that minimalism and simplicity can definitely well, simplify your life in a lot of very important ways. And I mean that is a sort of a critique that we've heard about modern society, where there is this constant need to keep up with the Joneses, so to speak, where we always have to continually consume and gain all these things we might not necessarily need. And yeah, I guess trying to
Yeah,
show that off can be it's a little off-putting for people that maybe live outside of Hollywood.
yeah,
Where you
yeah.
don't want
I
to.
have one example of generosity too, since that's basically like an act of kindness where there's a readiness to give something more than expected. And when I was in co-op in high school, I had a job as a web designer, and I had this really generous boss who paid me and also gave me a Palm Pilot at the job, which was great because for co-op you're not supposed to get paid,
Mhm.
but he still did it anyways, and I was kind of just floored by it, right? So
Yeah, and
that
for
was
those who
good.
are unfamiliar, because there's certainly a possibility of that, the Palm Pilot was basically the original mainstream PDA that
That's
I
right.
guess predated the smartphone. In fact, I think the Palm Trio was probably the first introduction of like a true smartphone, which was a Palm Pilot that had network capabilities. But in hindsight, those things were pretty terrible by today's standards.
Yeah, they were the beginning steps though, for sure. And for stinginess, I just think of, Scrooge, A
Perfect.
Christmas Tale, and
Yeah.
you know his stinginess with his worker Cratchit, I think his name was. He didn't like
Bob
give him
Cratchit.
any extra money for
Yeah,
Christmas,
and
and
no coal for the fireplace because I guess it's more productive to work in a freezing cold office than not. I don't know.
yeah.
They never really explained that one, but I think what they were probably talking about was sort of this archetype rather than an actual person, where it's sort of somebody who embodies all of these horrible characteristics, and then the journey he
Yeah.
has to go through to get himself out of that. And I guess if we think about what it was that caused Scrooge to, I guess, lose his miserliness, was, I guess, confronting his own mortality. And that was, how he saw, like, oh,
Mm,
this is how people are going to talk to me after I die. This is the legacy that I'm going to leave. And I think that was a real shocker for him. And maybe that's what helped pull him out of it.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Leads to our next virtue, ambition. And this is the sphere of honor and dishonor.
Hmm.
And so with the deficiency, we've got sloth, and then the excess is greed.
So if somebody is overly ambitious, they'd be considered greedy. Now, I don't know, maybe this is just a weird translation because greed is sort of a weird word. If you have a price for something and somebody else is willing to pay it, I don't know, it's hard to call
Mm,
that greedy necessarily. I suppose unless or you were to use some mechanism like the state to eliminate your competition and then jack up your prices, in which case, yeah, I could definitely see that as being greedy. And sloth, everyone's favorite weird ass animal, that's just really slow and unambitious. So, what do you think about sloth and how that could affect somebody's embodiment of virtue?
right. Well, I see it as habitually avoiding action or effort, and it's basically
Yeah.
laziness too. So if we don't really, do the things we need to do that are calling out to us, like in our present condition, then we can't really achieve anything.
Yeah, you want to make
So,
effective bargains with the future, right? You don't want to
yeah,
make zero bargains with the future. Engage in everything you want right now and save nothing for later. I mean, I'm sure
you
there's
don't want to be completely passive.
definitely you want to be able to take some control over your own life, because I think a lot of what we talked about in the last couple episodes with depression and anxiety could be facilitated or enabled by things like sloth and laziness, where, if you don't get off your ass and do something, eventually you're going to get to a point where, like, shit, why is my life so terrible? It's like, well, what have you been doing for the last 10 years? If it's nothing, then, well, obviously, your life's not going to work out the way you want. It's, I guess you have to choose your suffering effectively. You don't get the choice to have no suffering. It's just not really something that life offers people. It's either you take the pain now or you take the pain later, and inevitably the pain later is going to be worse. So it's definitely good to get on that as quickly as possible.
Yes. So it's about seeing ahead.
Yeah.
Planning ahead.
And
sure.
I think with greed, I think if you were to talk like about someone who's overly ambitious, somebody who'd be willing to step on other people to get what they want, have no consideration for how their actions might affect other people negatively, stuff like that. I think that might be a more, modern context for what ambition to a pathological degree would really represent.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically like an intense selfish desire for something, such as wealth or power or, other, and it seems like it's like basing your self-worth on possessions. Like it could be linked to that sort of.
Yeah, and everybody loves possessions. Everybody loves wealth. And it's not like these things in and of themselves are a problem, but I think it's fairly self-evident when, you sort of talk about an excess of these things where someone, I guess, and I hate to bring it back to an Adam Sandler movie, but when we think of that movie Click, where he basically puts his life on fast forward and just basically, okay, well, right now I want to advance in my career. It's like, okay, well, let's see what happens in 10 years if that's your only desire. You know what I mean? And he ends up
sacrifice key components of your life.
Yeah.
That's, I think, what mainly happens. And it's funny because I thought of another Adam Sandler movie for sloth, an example, Billy Madison.
Perfect. Man.
Because, in the beginning, he's living at his father's mansion, just like getting drunk every day and looking at porno magazines.
And drawing on himself with sunscreen.
Imaginary penguins.
Yes. So that maybe Adam Sandler is a little bit deeper than we give him credit for.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe just in hindsight, it's like, oh wow, maybe those movies did have a point. Shit. All right. And next up, we got modesty. So I guess an excess of modesty they call pride. Or and a deficiency of modesty being humility. Now, I guess the way this is worded, I don't know. It seems a little bit harder to swallow than I guess just talking about modesty in and of itself. So someone who's maybe deficient in this modesty, or doesn't speak up for themselves enough, they have almost, I would say, an excess of humility rather than a deficiency of modesty. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. I think like with the deficiency, it's basically like you're undervaluing yourself.
Yeah.
And it's almost like too much self-deprecation. And it's it could be linked to like a sense of like, it's also linked to the sphere of shame. So that kind of gives us a hint as well.
So someone who's excessively ashamed of themselves might not really go to bat for themselves. And okay, so that would make sense.
Whereas modesty itself, it's just more of a humble estimate of your merits, your importance, and you're free from vanity and egotism and boastfulness. And the thing that I tend to think of is just people giving credit to like their team members, like if sharing credit, giving people credit where it's due. Like it's
definitely seen as
it's not all about them, essentially.
Yeah, it's definitely seen as a negative when somebody takes credit for something somebody else has done, especially if it's a leader.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like, well, here's an idea I came up with, and everybody knows. It's like, no, we know that person came up with it. Like, you're not fooling anybody, bud.
Right, exactly. And I think with pride, it's just it's an excessively high opinion of oneself or one's importance, and also a sense of shamelessness. And the example I thought of for this was, you remember that Simpsons episode when they do the Springfield Movie Festival?
Okay.
And Mr. Burns has the movie with Senor Spielbergo. And basically Mr. Burns is like, he's like first a Mexican revolutionary, and then he's in like the place of ET, and then the next part he's like helping some slave in a desert, gives him like a bottle of water.
So basically taking credit for all the archetypal heroes of history, yeah.
Yeah, and he says, "You truly are the king of kings," and then everyone hates the movie.
Absolutely.
It's so, like, egotistical.
A little bit. Yeah, I definitely hear that. So it almost seems like this would be self-awareness, in a sense. Like someone who has a deficiency in this might only look at the negatives of themselves, whereas someone on the other side only looks at the positives without any of the negatives. So having a healthy self-awareness and an understanding of our own faults as well as our own values and virtues and stuff like that, and seeing it in congruence with reality is definitely going to be more important than swinging too far in the other direction. And I think this is probably one of the problems that I have with the whole self-esteem movement that we went through when we were in elementary school and high school, where there was this huge push like, oh, well, kids just need to have more self-esteem, but it's despicable, really. It's sort of like, well, why do we have a participation trophy generation? It's like, well, everyone just expects to be proud of something that they never achieved. You know, people want to have like pride in themselves without having done anything to achieve it. So when life eventually comes and hits you, you have really nothing to fall back on because you haven't done anything. And this whole self-esteem thing is really not going to help you with that.
Yeah. Well, the problem is I don't remember them really defining what self-esteem is or really how to build it in a proper way.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't think there's anything really wrong with self-esteem, and I actually have some ideas we can maybe bring in for another episode. But the issue is like, how are you supposed to have self-esteem for basically doing nothing? But at the same point, like, we all have our own worth as a person, and that shouldn't be disregarded. But I hear what you're saying about like the participation trophy thing too, right?
Yeah.
And
because I guess the thinking was is like, well, if we could just make everyone feel better about themselves, then the world will be a better place. It's like, well, no, what if people feel shitty about themselves, so they take the steps necessary to improve their lives, and as such everything else improves around them? However,
and that's it.
Yeah,
that's exactly it. And that's what self-esteem is about, is becoming more conscious of yourself and also your thinking ability, and building a sense of integrity.
Definitely. And I think maybe what they were conflating it was with this self-love, right? Where it's like, it is important to love yourself. You know what I mean? You don't want to hate yourself. And maybe that was what they were trying to push back against. It's like, well, we don't want to have this nihilistic generation that just hates not only themselves, but being itself. So the best way to get around that would just be like, well, everyone just feel better about themselves. But it's like that old example Molyneux always talks about all the tall people are on basketball teams, but putting someone on a basketball team isn't going to make them taller. We know how to make people shorter and weaker by depriving them of nutrition in early childhood, but if you just eat a lot when you're older, you're not going to get taller, you're just going to get wider. It doesn't work that way. So I think it's maybe just a case of putting the cart before the horse.
Yeah, it's a wrong solution, I guess, yeah.
Definitely, and that segues us nicely into the next virtue of honesty, where it is important that we are honest with ourselves. So a deficiency of honesty would be this sort of secrecy, and then the excess would be loquacity. Now, I remember you gave me a definition of this last time. You want to go over a little bit about what loquacity is?
Yeah, it's basically being like overly talkative, essentially. So, I have a few examples. One was I was recently at a job interview, and I won't go into too many details, but I just think that I might have said too many things rather than like about my current job situation or something.
Mm-hmm.
And I just get the sense that maybe I could have been a little more selective on things that I spoke about.
Okay.
And another example was I was just at a bar with a friend, and she was talking a lot about like her cell phone bill and her cell phone company, and
what a thrilling conversation that sounds like.
yeah, yeah, and it just felt like it was going on and on and on, and it just like there was just this tension building up in me, and it just went a lot more longer than it needed to be, right? So
Eventually you just got to be like, listen, half an hour is too long to talk about your cell phone, and it's not even like your phone itself. It's like, look at all the cool things this can do, and it's like, yeah, that's great. We've had cell phones for years. It's not that impressive, but talking about the cell phone company and all that, yeah, that's kind of a weird one. But I hear what you were saying before about the previous example. It almost makes me think of that term oversharing. You've heard of that before, where it's like if hey, how was your day today? It's like, oh well, I had this really great bowel movement. It's like, oh, okay, that's not exactly where I thought this was going to go. I was sort of just expecting a fine or an okay or something generic like that so that we could just sort of move on with a different topic. But
a little too much information, yeah.
Yeah, like I had, but it's interesting. Like if you listen carefully and you pay attention, quite often people will tell you something about their own experience that's so interesting and profound that you realize that they couldn't really make it up because it's such a unique perspective. Like, I was at the hospital the other day in the waiting room, and I was reading Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, and there was an elderly guy sitting next to me, and he asked me what that was. So I sort of explained to him that it's like a book that I was reading, and he was talking about how, like, cell phones are super dangerous and all that stuff. And so I just sort of paid attention and listened, and eventually I found out that he's trying to take Bell to court for a bunch of crap they put him through with in regards to his disability and all that. So I basically asked him, it's like, okay, so do you have a plan? And he's like, oh yeah, I got a ton of spare dynamite back at the farm. I was just like, oh man, like, I don't know, maybe don't be saying that shit in public. That's that was pretty. I mean, I'm sure he was joking, but it seems like if you push people to that length, it can definitely go south if you push people too far. And he was totally willing to share that with me, a complete stranger. So that just seemed like a funny example of an overshare. So and now the other side of it, the other side of this would be secrecy. Someone who, I don't know, what do you think? Like, secrecy, is that the right word, or would this be sort of
I think it's more like understatement, or like a half truth.
Ah, yes.
Or like a restrained representation of the facts. So let's say there was like an earthquake and a journalist wrote that, okay, the earthquake caused some damage, when in reality it caused a ton of damage.
Like, it just leveled a city, and it's like a few buildings came down. It's like, well, yeah, a few buildings came down. A lot of other buildings came down as well, and thousands of people were killed. But, there was some property damage. There was some dust on the sidewalk. And I guess the most poignant example I could think of with this would be, news outlets like CNN with the selective coverage. And it's not so much that they're lying through commission. It's more about lying through omission, like the stuff that they're not covering that's just as important, but because it doesn't fit the narrative, they kind of cut that out. So I think that would be definitely a deficiency of honesty in that regard.
Absolutely.
But again, it's important to maintain good humor about it, which is our next topic. So this would be a deficiency being someone who's really morose, and someone who has an excess of this good humor would, I guess, be a little on the absurd side, which is how we pronounce it now.
This is like the sphere of conversation. So yeah, like you said, the deficiency, someone who's more sullen and gloomy, ill-humored, maybe they're depressed or something, and they're having a harder time seeing the lighter side of life, taking in jokes, and so it might be, you don't
want to be a negative Nancy, so to speak.
And the balance would be cleverness and wittiness, so kind of like a mental sharpness. And
the right time for humor and stuff like that, right?
And being quick and inventive when you're being humorous. And absurdity, it's more just a ridiculous, widely unreasonable, maybe outside the bounds of more normal social conduct in a sense. And you I think you mentioned that LOL.
Yes, I guess the way we normally conceive of this would be laugh out loud, but I found out from my sister recently some people actually use it to represent lots of love, which I think could be definitely taken out of context. Like if you're signing a bereavement card for someone in the office and you say something like, sorry for your loss, LOL. It's probably not going to be taken as like lots of love, right? They're going to be like, what do you mean LOL? That's not funny. This is a horrible situation. So, and stuff like, high fives at a funeral, things like this, where it's absurd. It's not the right circumstance for that kind of humor. So, having the ability to know when not to tell jokes is definitely important. You got to be able to read your audience and know that, okay, maybe these people aren't really in the mood for jokes, so maybe let's keep the humor to a minimum at this point, right? But if you were to have context is definitely important. Like, you want to have the right joke for the right person in the right circumstance, as Aristotle would probably say. Now, I guess the other side of this would be, if you're at a birthday party or right after a comedy show or something where everyone's sharing jokes and laughing, and you're like, yeah, guys, but you do realize that life is a sexually transmitted disease with a mortality rate of 100%. Everyone's like, oh, yeah, that's nice. That's a real great contribution to the conversation. You don't want to be too morose in those kind of circumstances, right? You want to be able to have that balance and not be a Debbie Downer and be a wet blanket and all that stuff, right?
Cool. Yeah.
So next up, we got friendship. So a deficiency being quarrelsomeness, and an excess being flattery. Now, I know with the flattery thing, when someone is being excessively friendly, this can also be very off-putting. You know what I mean? Someone you just met giving you all these compliments, and you're sort of like, well, I don't really know how to repay you for that because I don't know you that well. You don't know me that well. This feels a little weird.
Yeah, it's excessive and insincere praise to possibly further one's own interests, right?
Yeah, definitely. What does this person want out of me? What are they trying to get out of this? I mean, it doesn't seem genuine, and it could obviously be very off-putting for people. So
yeah, and it gets to the point where just too many compliments, it's just embarrassing.
Yeah, definitely. You start to feel that sense of embarrassment where it's not only does this person giving you compliments that you don't think they're qualified to give, but you also might start to feel like, okay, maybe I'm not really deserving of all this praise, and I'm probably not going to be able to live up to this example. Now, what about someone on the more deficient side, someone who's maybe a little bit more quarrelsome?
Just give me a sec.
Sure.
Sorry. All
right, so I guess Timmy has decided to be quarrelsome and run off in the middle of the show, but that's all right. Let's talk a little bit about those who are quarrelsome.
Sorry, just trying to let the cat out.
No worries.
So the quarrelsomeness, it's when you're too argumentative and disagreeable,
right?
I would say, and just making things unnecessarily worse than they need to be.
For sure. Like, we know that agreeableness is one of the big 5 personality traits. So somebody who maybe has a deficiency of agreeableness might try to find fault in everything. I find, like on the Art of Charm podcast, they talk about these low-value behaviors, and one of them would be the excessively competitive person, where you tell a story and they're like, oh yeah, well here's this like similar story. And it's like, it's even worse when they're like, here's a similar story my buddy told me. And it's like, well, it's not even your fucking story. And you're doing it just to be what we would call a topper. Somebody who always has to go above and beyond and tell a way more interesting story than the one you were telling, right? Kind of a pain in the ass, really.
Trying to like one up.
Yeah, exactly. You don't want to be doing that. It's it's always good to make a contribution to the conversation, but eventually people will begin to develop or notice this pattern that you have of going out of your way to be seen as better than other people, and that's definitely not a good character trait that you want to embody, right?
And yeah, I just think of like people who just like to basically like pick fights, or they talk to you in a pretty like forceful way, or they just argue more, or they're just more angry.
Pathological aggression, like, perhaps?
Things that don't need that, right? So
yeah, and you definitely don't want to be doing that. I mean, it is important to have frank discussions sometimes, but if that's all you're having, you're probably not going to be making a very valuable contribution to your friendships. So finding the middle ground between not arguing too much, but then also not being excessively flattering of other people. So finding a golden mean, I think that also ties back into honesty, where you're being able to relate to other people in an honest manner, which is definitely very important.
For
Next up,
sure.
we got temperance. Now, I know we had a little trouble with this one because it is sort of a weird word for, I guess, a balance between someone who's, incredibly self-indulgent and someone with insensibility. So what do you think about the
Mm-hmm.
wording of these ones here?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think with insensibility, I was reading in the actual book, like they basically just didn't have a name to call that excess of temperance. So
Hmm.
I think it's more just like an overregulation, like maybe too much order in your life, too much restriction,
Not enough
where
chaos. Someone
it's
who's pathologically conscientious and orderly, where they can't have even
yeah.
anything out of place. Now, I think one of the ways we had illustrated this before was for those of you who are in university or college living away from home and you're living with roommates for the first time, these are distinctions that will probably become quite evident after the first couple of months, where you have people that really, really like to have the place clean and those other people who couldn't give a shit about what the place looks like. So
Mm,
you'll end
mm,
up having certain people, cleaning a lot and other people making a lot of mess, and this can lead to a lot of conflict. So you definitely want to try to walk the mean there. Don't be, I guess, super orderly and make everyone else's life miserable because there was one dish left in the sink, but you also don't want to be the guy that's, making a mess and never cleaning up after themselves, right?
mm. Yeah, and the self-indulgence that's this is in the sphere of pleasure and pain, of course. So, you know, the self-indulgence, it leads to, you could say it leads to like a sense of hedonism and also gluttony and lust. And so it's like an excessive focus on pleasure and hence a lack of moderation. And you could say it's like burning the candle at both sides, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so let's say you eat a lot of fast food, you're drinking a lot, you're having eating a lot of desserts, and all these things combined together, it's not gonna turn out for a
Yeah, you're going to live
good
a very good life for about 40 years, and then that's it. So you probably
yeah,
want to space that out a little bit, and you'll live twice as long. Now, I
yeah.
remember when we saw this one, it made me think a little bit about the temperance movement back in the 1920s. You had people
Hmm.
that were excessively orderly in that never have a drink, don't even touch the stuff, and then the other people that would go get shit faced on their lunch break every single day and after work every single day. And a lot of people would die young back then, so maybe that was sort of the way of dealing with that chaos, right? And I guess if you
Hmm.
think about life as being kind of tragic, the argument becomes, well, why not just pursue hedonism, right? It's,
Hmm.
just live in the now, live in the moment, never save for the future because we're all going to die anyway. And it's like, well, yeah, I guess, but, there's maybe a different path one could take that would lead to the eudaimonia that we talk about a little bit and getting themselves sorted out effectively.
Yeah, I mean, those two, instances are both excesses. Like it doesn't have to mean like you don't do it at all, or on the other side where
Do it all the time. All the
do it all the
time.
time, right?
Yeah, so you want to
It's
find
nice
that.
to, yeah, to be able to come to the middle. And I think, in that instance, there's more balance, and you can have some fun once in a while too.
And I think that nowadays, like the people are a little bit more temperate. Like by the time you're in your 30s, 40s, you have family and other
Mm.
responsibilities. It's not really seen as socially responsible to be going out and getting shit faced all the time. But for someone who's in university, that they might get more of a pass for that because they don't have those same responsibilities. But
Right,
yeah,
right.
I think walking that middle line is definitely important. So next up we have composure. So this would be a balance between completely apathetic behavior versus really, really irritable behavior.
This is the sphere of anger. And I think with composure, you could probably substitute that with patience, which is the capacity to accept and tolerate delay, trouble, and suffering without getting angry or upset.
Hmm.
Um, and I've got a good example of this. I was doing a group presentation, and earlier in the winter. And anyways, we we basically said some lines together at once, and a few things got out of sync during the presentation, and
Mm.
I did feel kind of angry, but I didn't like lose it or anything. I just kept going
Yeah.
with the presentation, going through the lines and everything. So I think that was a good example of composure or patience. And whereas with the excesses would be irritability, but that could be also like wrath or rage, bad temper,
Mm-hmm.
you know. Another example for that one, I was in a band for a while, and basically I got fed up with the situation. Like we weren't really doing much. Like we were just basically practicing, and essentially I tried to book us some live shows, but it didn't end up happening, and I just got really pissed off and just thought, well, screw it, what's the point? And I suggested maybe we should stop the band, and that's what happened. And in hindsight, I'm kind of reconsidering that decision, but I wasn't happy at the time. So
well, you were getting pretty irritated with the result, and the rest of them were really apathetic about the result. So obviously there's going to be a conflict of composure there, right? Where if you all want different things and you're not sort of agreeing what those values are, then it can be very difficult to move forward in any really productive way. Yeah, exactly. You're not going to be producing much if half of them don't give a shit, and then the other half of the people give way too much of a shit. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So with apathy, it's like a lack of spirit or interest, enthusiasm, concern. And yeah, I mean, this is a really, really deadly one, because I struggle with this at times too, when I get like in a negative mindset, and you just wonder what's the point of certain things or doing this or that, right? And yeah, it's a tough one, but it's good to remind yourself that it's a deficiency, and it is. I've always felt it's important to gear oneself towards a purposeful life and trying to see the meaning in our actions, and
pursue that which is meaningful, not that which is expedient, perhaps.
Yes, exactly.
Yep. Rule number 7,
which is a difficult road.
Yes,
but
because I mean, obviously, pursuing what is pleasurable and expedient is definitely an easier path, and it has its appeals. But it doesn't tend to have as good of a long-term outcome as pursuing that which is meaningful, which leads us into our final virtue here of self-control, and why that would be important. So you want to maintain that balance between, I guess, indecisiveness and impulsiveness. Now, this one seems a little bit easier to understand. Someone who has a deficiency of that self-control, they're not going to be able to decide how to do anything, and the person who has this excess of it might be a little on the impulsive side.
And I thought you could actually switch impulsiveness and indecisiveness, because it would kind of make sense. Like if someone had too much self-control, then maybe they wouldn't decide on anything. Whereas if they don't have enough self-control, they'll be impulsive, right? Hence a defificiency.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yeah, that makes...
it could be that they could be switched around in a way.
That actually makes way more sense than this chart.
Yeah.
It's like, if you lack self-control, you'd probably be more impulsive. And if you have way too much self-control, then how do you decide which path is the correct one, right?
Yeah. So...
and I think this probably ties back into the first one with courage, right? Like someone who's, really impulsive, they might be more prone to being rash. And then someone who's really indecisive is probably a little on the cowardly side. Did
you want to tell us a bit about Phineas Gage?
Oh, yeah.
Impulsiveness?
Phineas Gage, yeah. This was an interesting story that happened, I think, a couple hundred years ago, where what people used to do as a form of work was they'd break up boulders. And I guess if you've ever seen a field that hasn't been prepped for farming, there are just boulders everywhere, and there's not going to be a whole lot you can do with that. So what you would have to do would be drill a hole into the boulder, fill it with gunpowder, tamp down a bunch of cotton with a big metal rod in order to compact it down there and focus the energy to blow the boulder apart. But I guess Phineas forgot to put the cotton in, which is bad because these rods are made of solid iron, so it would create sparks. And what happened was when he went to go tamp down the gunpowder, it exploded, and the rod shot right up through his eye socket out the top of his head and landed about 100 meters behind him. And what this did was it basically completely eviscerated the frontal lobe of his brain, which we know now is tied in with a lot of executive function, planning, impulse control, things like that. And miraculously, he survived. Like, they got him to the hospital, they got him patched up and stabilized and all that, and he was conscious the whole time. Because if you were to lesion the front of the brain, it's not going to have any effect on the central nervous system or the kind of structures you need to actually stay alive. But what happened was when he came back to work, he was a completely different person. People couldn't believe that he was, so angry and impulsive and all these other things, and they didn't know who this person was, and he wasn't really able to hold down a job very effectively after that because of that lack of executive function. And I know we also talked a little bit about how this is the last structure of the brain to get developed in humans. It's one of the more recent adaptations, and it also develops latest in our maturity. So this isn't actually fully functional till you're, I think, in your mid-20s or so, which does help to explain the impulsiveness of youth.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and the digestion of Tide Pods.
Oh yes. This is why they're eating Tide Pods and pulling condoms through their nose and all this kind of stuff. Well, maybe you never thought about what the consequences of that was, but that's also, I think, just a cry for attention, which is unfortunate. Where I think people will measure their social status by their Instagram followers or their Facebook likes or their retweets or things like that, where they're these sort of artificial indicators of being social, but they're really not. So, you definitely don't want to have that happen. And what was it? I think Peterson was talking before about how unfortunately, the model we have right now for getting rid of violent offenders, because violent kind of stuff, that tends to peak around the age of 15, and it drops off quite precipitously after that. So if people are really engaging in a lot of criminal activity, the best we can really do is just put them in jail till they're 27 and then let them out, because they'll probably not reoffend after that, because that tendency tends to drop off quite a lot. But the catch-22 of that is that the worst thing that you can do for antisocial people is put them into groups with other antisocial people. So what do we really do about that? And I mean, how to deal with criminal offenders and stuff? It's been a challenge for society since time immemorial. So
right,
I don't know. What do you think we should do about that? Do we have a solution for what to do about the criminal elements of society?
Wow. That's a tall order, Steve.
Yeah, I think maybe we'll leave that for another episode when we have some time to think about that. Because sure. What else do you do with that?
Yeah. So self-control. It's linked to the other virtue of prudence. So ability to judge between actions appropriately at a given time. And also indecisiveness, being stuck and not being able to make decisions and not being able to act. And I think this links to what we talked a bit about anxiety too, right? Mm-hmm. Being in the grips of that and being afraid to make decisions because you might think that you might catastrophize and think that nothing's going to work well no matter which decision you make. So why even bother? Yeah,
sometimes having too many options can be just as bad as having no options at all, because you're sort of paralysis by analysis. I think that term goes. Yeah. We are so busy trying to figure out what to do that you never really get around to doing anything. And I know for us, we were trying to figure out how to go about doing this podcast. And I guess it's like, well, let's just start it. Let's just do it. Because we're not going to know until we actually, get into it. So, we'll do it badly for the first little while, and then we'll see what we can do to tweak it and improve it and all that stuff. But if you try to work that stuff out all beforehand, you're just never going to do anything.
Exactly. And, that's the thing. Like, I've been learning as I've been going on, as I'm sure you have, and it's been interesting, and I've been getting a lot out of it for sure.
Because we have to speak in order to think. You know what I mean? We have to get our thoughts out there in order to actually formulate what our thoughts are. Like your cat right there just decided it would be a great idea to hop up on the back of the chair. Oh, adorable.
Yeah, and I think with indecisiveness, it's just good to ask, like, what are your next actions that you can do and what's realistic, essentially, and because at some point we have to act given a problem, right? So it's
because the problem is just going to get bigger and bigger. That
it'll build up.
Yeah, that's a dragon you want to slay when it's this big, not when it fills a cave. You know what I mean?
Yeah, nip it in the bud.
Exactly. It's a great way to do that. Catch the problems early. Do not let them to grow out of control. Now, there was this last one we do have a bit of time for here. With the mean here, the virtue was righteous indignation, with an excess being envy, and a deficiency being malicious enjoyment. Do you want to talk a little bit about that one?
Yeah. So with righteous indignation, that's, that's essentially when you're repelled or even offended by something, so, if you strongly feel that you're, justified in this, that would be the mean. And whereas the excess would be a sort of envy or jealousy. And the deficiency is, I guess it's kind of like a malevolence,
Okay.
in a sense, where you're getting, or maybe like sadism, where you're getting pleasure out of some sort of harm that's being done to someone.
Oh, is that like that Schadenfreude or whatever that term is for, I guess, deriving joy from the misfortune of other people?
Yeah. I think that's what it's what it's talking about. So,
because I know with when you mentioned this envy thing, I think there is a distinction between envy and jealousy that's important to illustrate. Envy is, I guess, being upset about something that someone else has, whereas jealousy is more about being upset that someone has something that you used to have. You know what I mean? So you're envious about the guy who's got that nice new car, but you're jealous because that car was just repoed from you last week. I don't know.
Oh, okay.
So that there is a bit of a gray area there where they do kind of overlap, but there is that distinction where jealousy it's more tied to something that you had personally and now somebody else has it, whereas envy is something that maybe you never had but you wish you did, if that makes any sense at all. But righteous indignation, I mean, I know that term does get thrown around quite a bit where, like the pearl clutching and won't someone think of the children? Stuff like that. But I think there are things that we do need to be indignant about, stuff that we shouldn't accept when boundaries are violated, when we see people behaving in malevolent manners. And I think there is a reason to stand up for that. But I think it can go too far now when we have this sort of emotionally anemic generation where the littlest prick will just cause them to bleed uncontrollably. And the slightest offense now needs to be treated as violence, and all this other nonsense that we're seeing on these university campuses where, these people don't seem to have the coping skills to deal with any sort of discomfort, but at the same time feel that they have the right not to feel uncomfortable, which seems to be a rather new development, because I don't remember any of this when I was in school. I mean, there would be a few people like that, but it wasn't the majority, and maybe it isn't. It's getting the most attention because they're the the tyranny of the shrill minority, with the people that scream the loudest, or the squeaky wheel that gets the grease, so to speak.
But life is inherently uncomfortable. I think there's no two ways about it.
Definitely, and where did we get this idea that it shouldn't be?
Yeah, exactly. And you're just always going to run into people that aren't going to share your same values or opinions. And I think it's learning to be okay with that, or maybe even seeing, what it is they're really getting at from the other side.
And I think enabling this kind of behavior is just as bad, because you don't want people to be feeling like they're the victim of a violent crime because somebody disagreed with them. I think that's a horrible outcome for people. It's you have to let people know that they can actually tolerate people having different opinions without you feeling that you need to shut them down. And unfortunately, I think a lot of that is happening now, where it's coming back to this whole, book burning idea, where it's like, we need to get rid of all these ideas that we don't like because somehow, which we haven't quite figured out how this is going to work, but I assume that if we just burn all the books that are bad, then we'll only have books that are good, and then we can have our utopia,
But who gets to decide that?
Well, obviously we do. Obviously. Yeah. Yeah, so I think this is it's important to be indignant about the right things in the right situations with the right people. So I think that would fit in with this Aristotle style of thinking. So was there anything else that we wanted to go over here for these virtues? Well, maybe just some closing remarks about why these virtues will help you lead a better life.
I think that I think if you just take some time to reflect and think about, some interactions maybe with your family or coworkers or friends, you can kind of see these virtues sort of sprout up pretty much. I think, these are basically kind of like imprints of behavior that have been around for a very long period of time, and they've been expressed in different ways, but they've essentially helped. I think they've helped, society cooperate and progress.
Yeah, because we can
And
either be tyrants, we can be slaves, or we can negotiate. And if we don't negotiate, things are going to go bad really fast. And I think we're starting to see a little bit of that now, where there's this sort of divide between a lot of people on a lot of these grounds. But I think it's also important to see that, we can recognize when people aren't behaving virtuously, and you're going to learn a lot from the people in life that you have that, I guess, that reaction to, where you're like, well, I don't really like the way that is behaving. I can't really articulate why, but I know I don't want to be like that. And I think that's an important feeling to pay attention to, where, yeah, if you see something that you don't like, you want to make sure, well, I don't want to act that way. And that's probably the best you can do at this point, right? Because you can't really control the way other people act without the use of negotiation or, heaven help you, force. Because you definitely don't want to try to force people to act a certain way. I mean, you can give incentives here and there, but I think being manipulative and trying to coerce people is probably not the best way of going about that. So I think virtue can help you lead by example. If you were to act in a certain way and other people say, well, that guy's acting this way and things seem to be working out well, maybe I could embody some of that myself. Now, that's not going to be everybody, but it might be enough people to sort of say, well, if I act that way, maybe I can improve my life. And then when other people see that their lives are improving, and they start to think, well, why is their life improving? And you can see how they're acting differently and say, well, maybe I can do that too. So it's not going to be particularly expedient, but it's certainly better than the alternatives, which would be using force to tell people how to live their life and stuff like that. And we probably don't want to go down that path again, because we got a stack of bodies 100 million high from the 20th century that I don't think we can afford to repeat.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it comes down to the individual and individual responsibility, and taking an honest look at oneself and seeing what virtues you'd like to exercise and see what happens, because like life is an experiment in that way, right? And I definitely think that focusing on these will garner positive results, not just for yourself but people around you too. That's like what you said about setting an example.
Yeah, and the other thing is we have nothing better to do. You know what I mean? It's not like you have anything to lose by trying to act more virtuously. You know what I mean? You might have to burn off some of the elements of yourself that are not working for you, but if they're not working for you, why are you hanging on to them? That would be my question. Right. It's like, if you know that the behavior that you're doing is wrong and it's not serving you well, it's not serving anybody else well, maybe let it go and see what happens. At least stop doing the things that you know are wrong. I mean, we might not know exactly what the good is or what the best thing we could orient ourselves is, but at least we can orient ourselves away from that which is not effective.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think you made a great point there, for sure. It's just... I'm just trying to think, like it's kind of similar to what we said about, how, evil it can be infinite. It's very much more, spread among, where the good is finite. It's more of a narrow path. And even though, these are general terms, we can use our reason to see how they apply in our life relative to us and for our own situation. And it's like, what do you got to lose, right? I mean, if you're doing the same thing constantly over and you're not happy with it, and you're not getting the right results, then it might be time to
make a change, switch it up,
make a change, and try some new ideas. Yeah.
Definitely. All right. Well, let's end it on that. And if obviously if you guys have any questions, leave them in the comments section below, and we'll do our best to address them. But other than that, was there anything else you wanted to add here, Tim?
Yeah, I just want to say that, yeah, this is based on the wisdom of the past that, men have worked hard to develop and have created with their own experience. So why not, see what, these people have worked hard on and what they've discovered, and it gives us good ideas to use on our own. So
Fantastic.
yeah.
Well, we'll see you guys in a little while for our next episode. But until then, this is the Sorted Skeptics signing off.